Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to PsychoBible, babbling about psychology and theology. Okay, we're back for part 2 of my commentary on the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus song, A Message from the Gay Community. In part 1, I laid out the reality of the gay agenda, and how the LGBT lobby has been successfully using a sophisticated strategy. Before I go further, I just want to make something clear. Not everyone who has same-sex sexual attraction, engages in homosexual behavior or relationships, or identifies as LGBTQ+, is aligned with the gay agenda. Okay, there's a subset of such people that just want to figure out their identities and live a quiet life. If that's you, you have my sympathies, and I want the best for you. But the gay agenda is comprised of LGBTQ identified individuals and their allies, their non-LGBT identified allies, in the sexual revolution that want a society that accepts and celebrates any deviation from normative sexuality. And normative sexuality requires heterosexuality. And therefore, the gay agenda is the arm of the sexual revolution for deconstructing heteronormativity and elevating any alternative sexuality. For such people with that explicit aim, I don't have any tolerance. Once you understand that the gay agenda is part of the larger sexual revolution, then you know that it was inevitable that it would target children. As the song points out, repeatedly, the gay agenda is coming for your children. The evidence is everywhere. More and more cartoons and children's shows, from Blue's Clues to Arthur to Sesame Street, are featuring LGBT characters. Drag Queen Story Hour, we've been dealing with that for a few years. We have comprehensive sex ed going as early as kindergarten, using things like the genderbread person or the gender unicorn, where you got the Library Association that is very far left and is making sure their libraries are stocked with pro-LGBT books geared toward children. And the alarm is just now going out, and parents are just now realizing it. And thank God they're mobilizing. They're showing up at school board meetings and they're protesting at libraries. But the reality is the gay agenda has always been coming for your children. If you want to overhaul the belief system of an entire population, you don't concentrate all your efforts on changing adults. They're already set in their ways. As Kirk and Madsen pointed out, only a third are skeptics worth trying to persuade. So if you have a grand agenda with enough steam from a constant stream of financial backing, which the LGBT lobby does have, you play the long game of quietly and subtly influencing children. Everyone throughout history knows this. Like, you see it in the Bible, in the book of Daniel, when he and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taken to Babylon. Babylon takes the young and promising Hebrews so that they can indoctrinate them. Now, fortunately, they stay faithful. But we always see this concept. If you want to change a culture, you start with their children. Or you at least focus efforts on the children as much as you can. Hitler understood this. Nazi Germany had the Hitler Youth. And the church has always understood this. Why else do we have Sunday schools? We have youth ministries, kids ministries, and in fact, most of your mega churches, what helped them grow was having dynamic kids ministries. See, it's not necessarily nefarious to try to influence children and indoctrinate them. Indoctrinate means to teach. It's just the reality that the most impressionable market is children. So what we should be thinking about is, what are they being taught? Is it good for them and good for society and good for the future and future generations? But let's be clear. The goal isn't just to make kids more tolerant and compassionate as future adults. It's not the same as advocating for fair treatment of people with physical disabilities or ethnic minorities. It may have seemed like that was their goal, but that was only a step in the larger agenda. If it was the goal itself, then that would require seeing heterosexuality as the normative standard and homosexuality as an exception. But that is not what they want. Why? Because if we view homosexuality or transgenderism as exceptions to a normative standard, then we cannot guarantee the outcome. See, people with that understanding may end up agreeing that homosexual behavior is a sin. And if they do, they may react with angry indignation or with caring concern. See, among Christians and Jews and Muslims, they may address sin from a more punitive approach or from a more compassionate and caring approach, redemptive approach. Can't necessarily predict which way they're going to respond. On the other hand, they might not view it as a sin, but they may still see it as an ailment, a type of disorder, a pathology even, like the psychologists did until 1973, when the APA, American Psychiatric Association, removed homosexuality itself as a disorder, or 1980, when they removed ego-dystonic or unwanted homosexuality as a disorder. Or more preferably to the gay agenda, another outcome is that people may see it as a variation of human sexuality that is amoral, not moral in any way. Now, people who view it that way may have just indifference about it. Or, most preferably to the gay agenda, they may see homosexuals as an oppressed minority in need of protection and advocacy. So if we just view homosexuality as an exception or some variation or deviation from the norm, we've got a variety of outcomes of ways people will address it. The gay agenda doesn't want a variety of outcomes. They want one outcome, and that's total acceptance. And to guarantee that last outcome, tolerance is not good enough. Because what is tolerance? Tolerance is to actually disagree with something, but not actively oppose it. Okay, it's really to have more of a passive approach to something that you really don't particularly like. That's tolerance. The gay lobby was never looking for tolerance. And conservatives need to stop saying this. I thought this was the party of tolerance. Oh, people who always wanted tolerance, they're not so tolerant. Guess what? They never were looking for tolerance. It was always a lie that they wanted tolerance. The mission all along was to convert the population to embrace homosexuality as just as normal and good as heterosexuality. The agenda was to overturn heterosexuality as the normative standard for sexual behavior. And then, as the gay rights movement combined with queer theory, the goal has been to deconstruct all norms related to gender and sexuality. Then they could argue that any opposition to homosexuality is just based on irrational bigotry, hate, and fear. That's why you always see, oh, we're going to treat you not to fear. That's where you get the idea of homophobia and transphobia. It's to promote this idea that the only reason you would oppose the agenda is if you're irrational. So to this end of trying to get a society that is fully embracing and affirming of homosexuality and transgenderism, the agenda is to add people to their cause as early in life as possible, as either an ally or a member of the LGBTQ conglomeration. Getting children to be allies is actually relatively easy. Get them to draw upon their empathy. So to do that, you present homosexuals as sexual minorities and always talk about LGBT issues in terms of anti-bullying. Then as kids enter junior high and high school, you rely upon peer pressure to persuade kids to support the cause, using initiatives like the Day of Silence or National Coming Out Day. So you want to get on board with what everyone else is supporting, then you're going to participate, or at least not object. And so with a bombardment of pro-gay messages and stories of the plight of homosexuals, you can gradually develop sympathy among each generation to the point where they view it as like a righteous cause to be pro-gay. So getting allies among children, not so difficult. But the most secure way to get someone invested in the LGBTQ plus cause is to make them a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And deny it all you want, they are certainly recruiting. You can see the progression in the song by the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus. Verse 1, they say their aim is to convert your children to make them tolerant and fair. But this is misleading, because it's presenting the false dichotomy of either being gay affirming or being hateful and oppressive. And so if you're a conservative parent or just a traditional parent, you need the Gay Men's Chorus to help save your children from you corrupting them and making them hateful and oppressive. And so if you allow them to weaponize your guilt against yourself and your duty as a parent to train your children in biblically sound morality, then you'll haplessly let them carry you to their true agenda, just like a useful idiot. And so in verse 2, you see their plan to convert your children into allies and advocates, going to protests. That's not tolerance. Remember, tolerance means you actually disagree with something, but you let it go unhindered. You suffer its existence. They don't want that. And in the next verse, you see their true plan. They don't just want your children to be allies, they want them to be members of the LGBT community. Gen Z's gayer than Grindr? That's a triumphant recognition that through their systematic and systemic cultural influence, over time they've been able to gradually and yet dramatically increase the numbers of gay people in the population. Now, how have they been recruiting children to the LGBTQ? First, by isolating them from other viewpoints. Here's their plan. Argue that traditional sexuality is based only on religion, such as Christianity, and sanction religion from public education and the media. Present the religious people as bigoted and irrational, hence why we always refer to their objections as fear, like homophobia or transphobia. And in contrast, present your ideology as being based on science or the current understanding in psychology. And don't be afraid to use comparative psychology and evolutionary theory, saying things like animals engage in homosexuality and we're just animals too, so it's just as normal for us. The reality is the so-called science doesn't need to be true. They have yet to prove that homosexuality is genetic or caused by brain differences or in utero hormones. And yet that hasn't stopped the media and academia from talking about people being born that way without anyone challenging them to provide the evidence. Remember, Kirk and Madsen encouraged propaganda, and propaganda involves using false information to further an agenda. So the message does not need to be supported by actual facts. It just needs to fit the narrative, and you need to say it often enough. Next, you groom children to think sexually. Doesn't matter if they're too young to accurately understand the concepts or the weight of the issue. Like, really, think about this. The gay rights lobby is not like other civil rights movements. It's not the same as training up kids to be kind and compassionate to people of different skin colors or to people with physical disabilities. We're talking about getting children to think about sex acts. Now they'll try to disguise it though. That's why Kirk and Madsen advise talking about homosexuality all the time, but avoiding talking about the actual sexual behavior, the very thing they're advocating. How have they been grooming children and adolescents? First, they keep broadening what it means to be gay. Heck, gay is now passé. If you really want to be progressive, you got to be like a pansexual or demisexual or autosexual. Like, I don't know what's left, what's new. There's going to be so many different sexual identities. It's never ending. Okay, they keep expanding what LGBTQ plus includes. Any peculiarity in one's gender identity or sexual interest and behavior is now a distinct sexual identity. You're not attracted to a particular sex, but just to personalities? You're pansexual. You feel male one day and female the next? Gender fluid. Not attracted to anyone? Asexual. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And what this does is this preys on kids with a longing to be special. They want to stand out in some way. And even though they're still developing, if they notice anything atypical about their sexual interests, and they see that claiming it as an identity will get them special recognition, they'll do it. Heck, they see their favorite celebrities doing it all the time. A while ago, I told people it's going to get to the point that if you don't identify somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, you'll be looked at like some unsophisticated Neanderthal. Learn to vogue, as they sing in the song. Do what's trendy and popular, and accept your fate. So, vogue, it's this idea of being special, being popular. It's so flamboyant. It's exactly the attitude in the song. Notice also that everything is an identity. The emphasis, like I was saying before, is not on the behavior. See, this is important to get them to become allies as well as members, to get to see their sexual preferences not as something that is potentially changeable or unwanted, but something that they should embrace as indicative of who they are or what they are. And they want kids thinking about their gender and sexuality as early in life as possible. We've got celebrities promoting decisions to raise their kids gender neutral, so that when the child is older, they'll choose their own gender. They use tools like the genderbread person or gender unicorn, which are clearly geared toward preschoolers or kindergartners, to get them thinking critically about their identities. But kids these ages don't even have the brain capacities to do such abstract thinking. They are undermining their development of their reality testing. And the onus is being put on the children to decide their gender, sexuality, and what to do with their bodies. And that's being presented as the compassionate thing to do. But look at the precedent being set. You're telling children that they have the capacity to consent to sexual decisions, whether you're talking about sex with a person or a decision about blocking their puberty or taking cross-sex hormones or changing their sexual identity or gender identity. And what happens when the questions change from, well, what do you want to be, a boy or a girl, to, do you want to have sex with him or her? Do you want to have sex with this older person? Well, as the song said, you're correct if you believe that the gay agenda, if left unchecked, will corrupt your kids. Interesting choice of words there. You know, corruption of minors is a crime. And that brings us to the final and most obvious, though disturbing, way that the gay agenda uses to recruit young members. Pedophilia and pederasty, especially between males. This is so common that it's being called initiation into homosexuality. There's no surer way to recruit a boy into homosexuality than to seduce him. About 50% of gay men report early childhood sexual experiences or childhood sexual abuse. As Michael Swift said in a 1987 issue of Gay Community News, all churches who condemn us will be closed. We shall sodomize your sons. We shall seduce them in your schools, in your dormitories, in your gymnasiums, in your locker rooms, in your sports arenas, in your seminaries, in your youth groups. Now, before I go further, I have to make another disclaimer. One of the fears that I often encounter is that every person with same-sex attraction is a potential sexual offender or child molester. When guys with whom I work, or people I know with same-sex attraction, hear these assumptions or accusations, it is very hurtful. They already have immense shame. Unfounded claims that they're sexual predators just compounds it all the more. Okay? So I am not saying that people with same-sex attraction are necessarily child molesters. Please, do not suspect that people with SSA are predators without additional evidence. However, we must acknowledge the fact that sexual predation has benefited directly from the gay rights movement. From the beginning of the movement, pedophilia and homosexuality have been intertwined. When we begin breaking down the boundaries for appropriate sexual development and relationships, we provide cover for exploitation of children. So in some cases, yes, they are literally coming for your children. In fact, after the song was released, some internet sleuths pulled the roster of the Gay Men's Chorus and cross-referenced it with the Sex Offender Registry, looking for unique names. They found at least 4 matches, one in particular that seemed definite. Now, let me be clear. Same-sex attracted and LGBT identified people are often childhood sexual abuse survivors themselves. It's well known in the psych field that homosexuals had adverse childhood experiences, including sexual abuse, at higher rates than their heterosexual counterparts, usually at a rate of 2 to 4 times greater prevalence of childhood sexual abuse. And the sad truth is that most sexual abuse of gay men is done by other men. There's even a trend among lesbians. In 2001, a study by Tomeo, Templer, Anderson, and Kotler found that with 942 non-clinical adult participants, gay men and lesbian women reported a significantly higher rate of childhood molestation than did heterosexual men and women. 46% of the homosexual men, in contrast to 7% of the heterosexual men, reported homosexual molestation. 22% of lesbian women, in contrast to 1% of heterosexual women, reported homosexual molestation. This research is apparently the first survey that has reported substantial homosexual molestation of girls. There's been a lot of research on boys. Holmes and Slapp in 1998 reported adolescent boys, particularly those victimized by males, were up to 7 times more likely to identify themselves as homosexual or bisexual than peers who had not been abused. Now let me back up my claims by going over some history. Let's start with the father of the sexual revolution, Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was raised as a strict Methodist, abandoning theism when he discovered Darwin. He had bisexual attractions. In college, he volunteered as a Boy Scout leader, and he seduced boys and exposed them to pornography. He studied entomology, which is the study of insects, but his interest shifted to sex. In 1938, Indiana University asked him to teach a marriage course, which he used to propagate his deviant sexual beliefs. He gave the students intrusive questionnaires about their sexuality. Some students described it as like being raped. The Rockefeller Foundation gave him a grant to research sex. It shouldn't be too surprising to anyone who's been following Save Our Children or Save the Children or the Pizzagate scandals, that the Rockefeller Foundation was involved in sponsoring his research. They had their own globalist agenda, which they sponsored through the Council on Foreign Relations. So, Kinsey hired a staff and required everyone, including any spouses, to complete a sexual history questionnaire, which he used for potential blackmail. He pressured the staff to engage in homosexuality, swinging, and other perversions. Those not on board were filtered out. He recorded everything and kept his activities secret for many years until Judith Reisman exposed him in 1981. Kinsey's so-called research was just plain fraud. Though he claimed to document the lives of average Americans, the truth was that his reliable male sample was roughly 86% aberrant, made up of prisoners, homosexual activists, pimps, thieves, prostitutes, sex offenders, while his average women were similarly aberrant, including prostitutes that he redefined as married women. Then, in 1944, Kinsey looked up and met a serial pedophile named Rex King, whom Kinsey called Mr. Green in his writings. And King journaled in explicit detail his child abuse, and he gave Kinsey his journals, which Kinsey then used for his chapter on adult child sex in his book Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. He used this data to argue that children are sexual beings from birth. The data was based on the torture and rape of up to 1,200 children, with some boys being raped around the clock. King continued to molest children for another 10 years after meeting Kinsey, and he continued to provide these journals to Kinsey for his so-called research. Judith Reisman says, he recommended that adults could effectively aid their children to have better sexual lives by giving them orgasms at a very early age. Kinsey recruited pedophiles and incestuous males and females to rape up to 2,035 fainting, screaming, and struggling children as young as 2 months of age for his so-called data. This was explained away with scientific jargon, under the premise that children want to have sex but need time to get used to it. Kinsey believed that sexual deviancy was not abnormal, but actually the norm for 95% of the population. He claimed that children are sexual and potentially orgasmic from birth, womb to tomb. This hypothesis undercut every law aimed at protecting children from sexual predators. If his contentions were true, then child molesters were actually doing their victims a favor. He argued that, based on his interviews of 4,441 normal women, no measurable harm came from rape and molestation. And Kinsey's so-called research has influenced the field of human sexuality for decades. Virtually every study has stemmed directly or indirectly from his findings. It's from Kinsey that we got the lie that 10% of the population is exclusively same-sex attracted, when it was actually less than 2% at the time. It's that 10% figure that Kirk and Madsen cited as justification for saying it's completely arbitrary who ends up with which orientation. And yet, sadly, after it took decades to correct people who believed the 10% lie, the latest stats on millennials and Gen Z shows that at least 10% of them identify as LGBT. So, through persistent manipulation of the masses, the gay agenda was able to make the lie true. The American Bar Association used Kinsey's findings to overhaul the penal code, particularly pertaining to sexual offenses, forming the Model Penal Code. The MPC set out to change laws from being morally based to scientifically based. Remember what I said earlier? See, if we can relegate religion and all objections to homosexuality to something religious and thus moral, and then we can promote the acceptance of homosexuality as being based on science, as well as acceptance of all other forms of sexual deviancy as being based on science or current understandings of sexuality, then who knows what else that will affect? Certainly the penal code. The Kinsey Institute continues to have major influence all over the world to this day. In April of 2014, the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction was granted special consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. This decision was based in part on misleading testimony regarding the nature of their work provided by a Kinsey Institute representative to the United Nations Committee on Non-Governmental Organizations. And let's talk about child sex education. How did that all come about? In 1964, Dr. Mary Calderon, former medical director of Planned Parenthood, began the Sex Information and Educational Council of the United States, SIECUS, as an educational arm of the Kinsey Institute. Her objective from the outset was to open the minds of children to Kinsey's concepts about sexuality. She shared his view that America was too intolerant of homosexuality, promiscuity, and even child molestation. Okay, this is the founder of the organization that is pushing for comprehensive sex ed in all of our schools. Want some proof? In a 1980 speech to Planned Parenthood, she said, "Providing today's society with a very deep awareness of the vital importance of infant and childhood sexuality is now the primary goal of SIECUS." Okay, what sexuality or sexual identity or gratification should an infant and child be having? In 1985, at the SSSS Eastern Region Conference, she said, "What do we know about situations in which young children and older people, stronger people, have had a sexual relationship of one kind or another that has been pleasant and the child feels good about it because it's warm and seductive and tender?" Unquote. Well, maybe she's not the only one at SIECUS. Well, in 1976, in Forum magazine, Wardle Pomeroy, one of Kinsey's co-authors and a SIECUS co-founder, said, "Incest between adults and younger children can also prove to be a satisfying and enriching experience. Incestuous relationships can and do work out well." Unquote. I can go on and on about the impact the gay rights movement has had on children. NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, has been riding on the success of the gay rights movement for years. For decades, legislation for gay rights often contained a clause for lowering the age of consent. The 1972 Gay Rights Platform included this demand: repeal of all laws governing the age of sexual consent. Why would the Gay Rights Platform want to remove age of consent laws? I would also like to share some Facebook posts from Moira Grayland Peet, author of the memoir The Last Closet, The Dark Side of Avalon, which is about her homosexual and child molesting parents, Walter Breen and Marion Zimmer Bradley, a famous sci-fi writer. I've read that book. It's a tough read, but it's very powerful. And when the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus released their "We're Coming for Your Children" song, these were her reactions. July 9th, 2021. My dear friends, back when I first wrote my Hugo-nominated blog post, The Story of Moira Grayland, I had a mixed response to my story going public. Many were outraged, but a few thought protecting the gay community meant people like me had to be frightened and shamed into silence. If you want to read my book, The Last Closet, it is on Amazon. I am the child of famous gay authors, and I was brought up in Berkeley, near San Francisco, and I have known more sex offenders personally than most people will ever be aware of. Not only them, but their foul friends, who affected clerical collars to seem safer to their targets. Before I put my father in prison for molesting boys, I got to listen to him talk and talk and talk about sex with children, and even listen to my mother and their friends chiming in. I was meant to believe that all this was good and right, and that if I disagreed, I did, I was a prude and not living up to my potential. I was meant to become gay myself and teach others to approve. Naturally, so we would not protect our children from gay predators in the form of babysitters, scoutmasters, teachers, or other people in a position to initiate them into a life of complete misery. Naturally, I disappointed my parents with my dreams of a white picket fence, a husband, and children of my own. But I was expected not only to present them to the world as role models, but to tout their appalling philosophy. I was expected to believe and spout that what they had done to me and to other kids was good. It would make everyone happy. Yes, I know, that is quite sickening. When I started talking, some people were appalled and heartbroken. Others mentioned their own experiences, but a third group were actually terrifying in their response. They wanted me to shut up, because talking about gay child molesters and the fact that I was mentioning how many of them wanted to bring children into their sex lives was dangerous to the gay community. They regarded protecting the gay community from the human race, knowing their actual goals to be much more important than protecting children from them. They wanted me to shut up because they were afraid I would spoil their fun. I and other victim children in my generation am supposed to shut up lest the poor child molesters be identified and known as exactly what they are. Well, guess what? I will not be silent. I suggest you also refuse to be silent. For heaven's sake, think about it. Milo Yiannopoulos and George Takei talk about their initiation at the hands of much older men. It is much easier to corrupt and seduce a child than it is to risk your life coming on to a potentially straight man who might feed you a knuckle sandwich. Older cultures than ours know perfectly well what happens when sex-addicted males are allowed free access to children. Look at Afghanistan. Older men corrupt and abuse boys, and the boys grow up to abuse other boys. At least nobody there pretends it is a preference or a lifestyle. It is simply a repetition compulsion born of trauma, and it hurts children and the adults trapped in it. Now, before some well-meaning guest decides I am a homophobic bigot rather than a former victim and tries to post the idiotic Twitter response, here's the idiotic Twitter response. It doesn't really help. After all, they're not trying to teach kids to be tolerant. They are, as I put it, coming for your children. And we are not stupid. And then just recently on July 31st, I hope most of us know the mechanism used by sexual predators to obtain young, compliant partners. I am about to describe a terrible crime, and I will be somewhat graphic if not entirely, so be aware before reading further. Half of all gay men and almost 2/3 of lesbians admit to having been molested. The total population of gays is 1.6%. Now it's an outdated stat and it's mostly based on an older generation. So, interjection. 1 in 6 boys is molested, and the younger they are, the more likely they are to remain gay for life. As NAMBLA says, sex before 8 or else it's too late. The math says that gay predators have to be very busy. I read that where a straight pedophile might average 10 victims, a male gay pedophile averages 168 victims. How do I know about this particular atrocity? My father, Walter Breen, was a notorious pedophile and a founding member of NAMBLA. He died in prison after I caught him in the act of molesting an 11-year-old boy. I had to hear him describing his appalling, heartbreaking conquests for years, but could not stop him because it was only hearsay, and my mother and her companion refused to cooperate with my wish to call the cops on him and threatened me with a foster home if I insisted. He used to tell me that he needed to make sure that boys were awakened to their natural homosexuality before they were old enough to be ruined by a girl. I kid you not. Look up Breendoggle, Breendoggle. If you want to see just how brazen he was, and brace yourself. It is an account of my father publicly molesting upwards of 10 children, including a bunch of boys and girls as young as 3. I'm not kidding. I wish I was. The way it is done is for the criminal to get a young boy drunk or stoned, then manipulate him into letting the criminal perform a sexual act that would feel good to any male on earth, then accuse him of being gay because he had an unwilling physical response. It would be like saying he was gay because he bled when stabbed. It is a lie, but one a boy can be easily compelled to believe. The boy victim has been manipulated into believing something untrue, and the seed of doubt has been planted, even if he flees from his rapist afterwards. He'll never really feel secure in his masculinity after that, and will conclude that the lie has been told about him being gay just has to be true. After all, why would a trusted adult say it unless he saw something? Of course, the trusted adult is using the oldest con in the book, conquering someone who is incapable of fighting back, and the child will now be trapped, potentially forever. Millstones all around. End quote. So the reality is, children have always been and will continue to be the casualties of the sexual revolution and gay agenda. We shouldn't be surprised by all this, but we should be alarmed, appalled, and vigilant. When the Supreme Court decided on the Birchville case in 2015, legalizing gay marriage across the country, I predicted that we would now see gay couples represented in every mundane form of media, from toothpaste commercials to kids shows. And yet conservatives and former liberals act surprised when they see this stuff. What did you think was going to happen when we allowed the meaning of marriage to be corrupted and then replaced? The gay lobby wasn't looking to be treated like an exception, but part of the norm. And so now we want to see that represented in all forms of media. We took for granted that kids ought to develop a foundation of normative sexuality first, before even thinking about deviations from it. So what do? We need to fight to take back lost territory in the public square, in policy and education. And we cannot be afraid of the truth offending the people trying to redefine reality. Before they cut our tongues out, we must speak. Christians and conservatives, we need to get our identities back. We are not libertarians. Our response to sex ed shouldn't be that kids and teens shouldn't be taught about sex. Rather, they should be taught the truth about sex at age-appropriate levels. They should be taught that boys are boys, that boys will grow into men, and girls are girls, and that's determined by their genitalia. That's okay. That's appropriate. That's scientific. And we should be teaching that boys are meant for girls, for procreation. Now, if you don't want to teach more about the morality of that, like about marriage and what sexual sin is, understandable. But the reality is, the norm, based on natural law, is the male body makes no sense by itself. It is only made complete in that reproductive area by a woman. That's just reality. See, truth is what corresponds to reality. More on that in part 3. So I hope this video is helpful. I spent a few weeks doing research, and I can go on and on. There's so many ways that the gay agenda is impacting children and coming after them. As always, I have a lot to say. So if you want to hear more, check out more of my videos. Decide for yourself if you want to subscribe. Comment, like, and share them so the algorithm is forced to promote them. Until next time, God bless.